Hi, I'm Meshal Malik, and you're watching Indus Special. Now, according to a joint statement released by UNICEF and the International Labour Organization, millions of more children are at risk of being pushed into child labour due to the COVID-19 crisis. This will happen after a first time in 20 years of progress. Human rights activists around the world have been fighting against child labor for decades. But how more difficult will the fight get with these turbulent times? Let's discuss this further. Joining us for the conversation is Professor Lyal Sunga, who's a well-known professor of international human rights law and international humanitarian law. He joins us from Rome. Also joining us for this conversation is Mr. Benjamin Smith, who's a senior officer for corporate social responsibility and child labor specialist at International Labour Organization. He joins us from Greeley. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Mr. Smith, I'd like to begin with you. Now, when we talk about this figure, 2 million more children being pushed into child labor, it's a massive number. Can you just explain to us how that estimate has come into being?
First of all, I'd like to say that we're starting from a place where there are still 152 million children in child labor, according to our estimates before the pandemic. So there really is a very big risk that for the first time in 20 years, we're going to see an increase. So globally, the numbers of children in child labor have declined by almost 100 million since we started measuring 20 years ago. So this very positive trend and progress in eliminating child labor could very well be reversed. We'll have quantitative estimates of by how much in next year when we do our next global estimate. So right now, the report that we put out really sounds an alarm and is a call for a strong response to prevent the worst from happening.
Right. And of course, the sort is in order is to create that alarm for countries to take that preemptive action in order to prevent that from actually getting as bad as it's being reported. But Mr. Smith, when we're talking about the informal economy and how many of these children, at least 2/3 are the estimates, are working in the informal economies of the world, how do we measure those? How do we even get to actually determining how bad the situation is?
Yes, well, you put your finger on the problem, really, that the vast majority of child labor does occur in the informal economy. It occurs amongst populations that are most vulnerable to COVID-19, in fact. So informal economy workers, migrants, persons with disabilities, people on the move, internally displaced people, ethnic minorities, marginalized groups. So these are the groups that are least likely to be able to practice social distancing and have access to hand washing, sanitation facilities, and proper health care. So it's really an acute problem and kind of a double threat that is faced by these populations. So the informal economy has seen their incomes drop by over 60% just in the first month of this pandemic, according to ILO estimates. So you can see, and it's quite intuitive, that with increased poverty, with the interruption to education, that children are at risk of child labor as never before, probably.
Right. That's a very important point you talk about, the disruption in education and what that link is with child labor. Stay with me, Mr. Smith. I'm going to jump to Professor Lyal Sunga and talk to him about this. Professor Sunga, just in South Asia alone, it's estimated that many more children will join the already 32 million children who are out of school because of this pandemic. Can you tell us the link between being out of school and being more vulnerable to being exploited by various groups, various other employers, especially in the informal sector?
Well, yeah, there's a number of things that occur. One of them is that obviously it's more difficult for the parents to take care of the children when they're not in school. When school is interrupted, then it leaves children rather much more vulnerable to the exploitative work and the informal sector as well. sometimes that's the same thing in some cases. We're seeing that in some countries like Guatemala and Jordan and Brazil, where in 130 countries, as this report mentions, around 1 billion students have been affected by school closures. So the disruption in terms of regular family life and in terms of financial survival of the family puts extra pressures upon the adults to allow their children, or even to encourage them to start working as a way to survive financially. Of course, that's a very short-term survival tactic, which has very long-term deleterious effects, as was mentioned by Ben, mentioned very well. Education, but also it's related to health and physical, mental, moral, social development of the child, and that has longer-term effects on society as a whole. So this COVID-19 is really complicating and exacerbating the problem in so many different ways. It's going to be some time, I think, before we see the full effects, and it's difficult to measure and difficult to get a grip on as the situation unfolds. But I think it's really great that the ILO in Geneva and UNICEF have sounded this alarm as early as possible, because I think it's quite clear that this problem is looming in a very serious way for the world's children, especially those most vulnerable. And we're talking about migrants, refugees, and also the effects, I should mention, of being quarantined, and remittances are dropping. You'll see that in the Middle East. You mentioned South Asia. South Asia, a lot of people working in the Middle East who send remittances, and some of them are unfortunately child labor, which shouldn't be the case, but it's sometimes the case. But there are overall remittances that are being dropping. Right. And maybe one last thing I'd mention is that a 1% increase in poverty, as the report mentions, translates into a 0.7% increase in child labor, which is a very serious, very serious effect.
Right. Professor Sunga, I'm going to come back to you, and we're going to talk a little more about the rhetoric that surrounds child labor, especially by those who are at the end of employing these children. But before that, I want to talk to Mr. Benjamin Smith about exactly what we can classify as being child labor, because that ILO makes that distinction that not all work can be classified as child labor.
Yes, absolutely. We're not talking about household chores, and we're not talking about work that can actually be beneficial for children to learn values and contribute to their household. The problem is, and what child labor is work that interferes with schooling or that jeopardizes their health and safety. So it's a very important distinction to make. Minimum ages are important. So children have a right to education, and that compulsory education leaving age should be the same as the minimum age for entry into work, so that you don't have the risk of just increasing child labor because of your education policy. So really we are, and I think I'd like to also mention that our conventions dealing with child labor, the one on worst forms of child labor is very close to universal ratification in Pakistan, as in most other countries have ratified both of our conventions. So the legal framework is in place. The challenge is, of course, implementing it and translating that into programs that can offer alternatives to children and their parents.
What can we do about those programs? As you're saying, there need to be alternative programs in which children can be enrolled. We also know many of these countries battle a high rate of uneducated children, and a large part of that has to do with how inaccessible education is. How do we balance that conversation? Because for many parents, those who are under the poverty lines, the only solution is to send their children out to work.
Yes, exactly. And as the professor mentioned, our report that we released, the data shows that child labor is very closely linked to poverty. And when poverty increases by 1%, you have a 0.7% increase in child labor. So direct relationship. And so the response really needs to address those root causes of child labor. So decent work for parents as critical to child labor elimination. Rural development programs, most child labor, about 70% is in agriculture. So those small farms, they need support. They need to become more productive to increase household income. Now, that doesn't mean that we need to wait for economic progress and for poverty to be eliminated to deal with child labor. That the international community, in fact, has set a very close deadline, 2025, to end all forms of child labor. So that's going to require a lot more. It is going to require massive education investment, social protection. So these are transfers, for example, income support to families. These are things that are happening actually in response to the pandemic, which is encouraging. And it's sort of the flip side is the opportunity that the crisis presents, and that is to maintain these sorts of programs. Children aren't working during lockdown to the same degree as they were before, so it's an opportunity to keep them out of child labor, and that requires investments in education, social protection, and poverty alleviation.
Right. Mr. Smith, a lot of that I've talked to, especially in the last couple of months since the pandemic began, continuously emphasize on that very fact that this time presents us with many opportunities to actually change the systems that have been so strongly erected in society all around. But are countries actually seizing those opportunities? I mean, that's the real question, because the time to do them is now.
Yeah, absolutely. Some countries take important measures to make programs more inclusive, to formalize the informal economy. You pointed out the informal economy is really a breeding ground for child labor. It's outside the scope of labor law and government programs. And so, for example, in Italy, there have been measures to include migrant workers in social protection programs. And this is quite common. The ILO is tracking government responses, and things like wage subsidies, extending Social Security to those who previously weren't eligible for it, making sure that education programs, and I think this is probably the next step as schools reopen, very concerted efforts to not only re-enroll all those children who were previously enrolled, but reach out to those who are out of school,
right,
and provide them alternatives and appropriate education options.
Right. Professor Lyal Sunga, coming back to that aspect of how we can change the rhetoric surrounding child labor, one argument that is frequently proposed, especially in South Asia, in terms of domestic help, is that the employers are in fact doing a favor on these children who would otherwise be on the streets. And given that, as Mr. Smith stated, that we shouldn't have to wait to eliminate poverty in order to eliminate child labor, how do we deal with those arguments?
Well, I just reiterate what Ben said, I think, very well, which is that there's a big difference between household chores or a few hours per week, which can help out in some, or in working in family businesses. And the ILO actually has dealt with that issue and distinguishes quite well between this kind of informal work in a very limited fashion and the kind of work that actually is harmful for the health of the child, or which, most importantly, interferes with the right to education. And there's a big difference there. So I think that whatever rhetoric is out there that still hangs on is less and less persuasive, because And I don't think it's so much a problem of rhetoric. I remember 15, 20 years ago, governments, there was a certain amount of pushback, and the ILO had to deal with that and to try to accommodate to a certain extent. And they've done that with the flexibility in terms of child labor laws and trying to recognize where a very limited amount of work might be acceptable or even good for the child. But as I say, limited. And now I think it's really more a situation of desperation and difficult financial circumstances, which is putting the pressure on all countries around the world, but especially those countries that are developing. And the solution to this is one that is embedded or in the DNA of the International Labour Organization ever since it was founded in 1919, which is a tripartite solution, which is governments have to work closely with the employers and workers' organizations to ensure that labor protection is as strong as it can be. And that helps adults and within the family situation, children as well, and also to wipe out, continue the fight against child labor. So I'm not sure that the rhetoric is really as strong as it used to be. I think most governments, at least formally and more and more in implementation, have recognized that child labor is a bad thing. And that's why we saw so much progress since 2000, right. About 94 million.
Professor Sunga, I want to just, sorry to interrupt there, but I just want to give an example of where I'm heading with this, which is a month back, an 8-year-old girl was killed. Domestic help was killed because her employers caught her opening a cage to release 2 parrots. This happened in Pakistan, and it shocked the country. But what was stated after it was, this is not new. This has happened many times around. And it continues to be a problem because those who employ these children believe that they are doing a favor for them. They're taking them off the streets. They're taking them away from dangerous situations otherwise. But these children are still vulnerable in their homes. That's exactly the type of conversation I'd like for you to give your opinion on.
Sure. I think the obvious answer to that is that if you do something nice for somebody or good for somebody in some way, it doesn't mean that you can exploit all their rights and end up obviously taking their lives or abusing them in any way. So for me, it's a very transparent and argument that doesn't hold any water. And I wonder whether people even who make those arguments really believe them. It sounds to me like empty justifications. Right. And if we go back to, basically the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, and or as Benjamin was alluding to, the ILO Convention 182 on worst forms of exploitation of child labor, you see that these things, these conventions, which are universally ratified, almost. Are aimed, and they do register government's recognition that they have to do better. Right. Now, what you're talking about is still important because at let's say, the village level or in rural areas, many times, people do still use these arguments, and for that we need public campaigns, awareness programs, and in the school system, as well as labor inspection and all, the whole raft of government action to stigmatize child labor and to make sure that it doesn't come back as the pernicious, pernicious
Professor Sunga, stay with me. I'm going to jump to Mr. Smith on that point. Mr. Smith, what can we do for that greater community engagement where child labor in the communities that it still remains to be so pervasive? How can organizations work to bring about that awareness? Because it seems like everyone knows that it is wrong, and yet it continues to persist as a problem. What more can we do in terms of awareness?
Yes, so I think Professor Sunga put it very well in pointing to the importance of awareness raising campaigns. The messaging has to be attuned to the realities that families face. A lot of times we find that really raising awareness about the hazards of child labor can be very effective. Parents don't necessarily know the risks that are faced when children, for example, use household cleaning products that are perhaps toxic or pesticides. So it's important to remember that children's bodies are very susceptible, unlike adults, to these things. And with knowledge comes, the ability and that motivation to protect children and to ensure that they can learn skills, but in the proper way, without jeopardizing their health or safety and without jeopardizing their compulsory education. So I think awareness raising campaigns, absolutely, but it can't be, we're going to come in and throw parents in prison for, being in dire economic straits that they find themselves, that prompts so much of the child labor problem. It has to be, as I say, sensitive to those considerations and really go hand in hand with alternatives, economic alternatives particularly.
Right. This is such an interesting conversation, but we're going to have to end it here. Thank you so much, Mr. Benjamin Smith, for joining us from Relief, Professor Lyal Sunga for joining us from Rome. We're going to go for a short break, but when we come back, we discuss what we know about the impact of video games on the mind. Stay with us. Welcome back. A global data report by Nielsen states that 83% of consumers have played more video games during the COVID-19 pandemic. The same research is echoed by the World Economic Forum that stated that revenues for many gaming companies and platforms have increased during the pandemic. But while this is great news for those who are making the profits, what does this mean for the mental health of the users? Let's find out. Joining us for this conversation today is Sehadat Ekman, who's a psychologist, works on anxiety, distraction, and hyperactivity. She's also the author of Digital Psychological Reevaluation. She joins us from Istanbul. Also joining us today is Mr. Shayan, who's the founder and president of Worldwide Studio at Revolving Games, based in San Francisco and Lahore. He joins us from Lahore. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Ms. Ekman, I'd like to begin with you. Now, talking about the rise in gaming, should we have a discussion about how it impacts the user's mental health, or should we only perceive it as an escape from boredom?
As you know, that as you talk, after COVID-19, it's increased. Even our client, normally, let's say 10% of our client was using the game, but nowadays almost half of our client start using the games and computers, and is also really we are really anxious about it, and because also it's affecting their mental health. At the same time, it's affect their educational life, academic life. So I wanna tell you one more thing, which is basically, maybe you heard about it. The more children, especially the babies, using the computers and the phones, they become the screen autism, because they can hardly read the others' emotions, and even it's affect their mental health. As well as when we talk about the teenagers and adults, we can see the depressions among those group of people, and also loneliness.
Ms. Ekman, I'd just like to interject here. I would to interject here and ask you a question. Those who form symptoms such as symptoms related to anxiety and depression after playing video games, is it due to the video games, or is it that already existing underlying conditions are then aggravated because of the violence and the anxiety and the dopamine rush that comes with playing games?
Yeah. Right, because we have a tolerance in our brain, dopamine tolerance. The more we get it, the more we want it. For example, at the first phase, we just get fun. We just play the game and fun. And second phases, it's very less fun. But the third phases, we just can't stop it, can't leave it playing the game. We just want to play. But at the same time, if you ask the children, let's go outside with your friends, let's have a family time together, it's not a pleasure for them because they got this pleasure from the games. So when we talk about the depression or anxiety, of course, it's more related with the games because in the games you are alone there. You can control the life. You cannot control the life, but you can control the game. You can be the boss of the game. But in your life, someone is controlling you. You have a parent, you have a teachers, you have a lecturers. So this is really important. And the other part that I wanted to mention that, you know,
Ms. Ekman,
when we
if
look
you could
at
just
our
stay with me, and
yes.
if you could just stay with me, I'm going to come back to talking about how this is, in fact, a disorder, something that the World Health Organization has also stated that it is. But before that, I want to jump to Shayan and talk to him about this culture of gaming that has evolved. And we're seeing such a sharp increase in it, especially in the past couple of years or so. How do you think it got to where it is now?
So I think it's, I mean, if you look at gaming, it's a form of entertainment, right? So you had your Netflix that people have been, I mean, binging on since the past couple of years. And gaming is pretty much, you know, in the same sort of environment because at the end of the day, it is entertainment. As far as the effects go, I think I think everything has a negative and a positive, but it's how you approach things. So excessive everything is, of course, bad. I mean, if you start drinking too much, it's going to be bad for you. It might have some negative effects. But I mean, I could go on and on about this. But yeah, the surge has been there, of course, because it's because of COVID. Everyone's been at home. You need some form of entertainment, and I think gaming provides you that. And the best part about that is because you have a variety to select from. So it's not necessarily the graphic games that people generally talk about, but look at Candy Crush or games such as Roblox that most of the kids are playing these days. And I'm talking about kids from the age of 5 to 10. It's actually beneficial for them, or it has been beneficial for them because they're actually coding in it and making games that other kids could play.
Right.
So yeah, that's...
Right. Shayan, you mentioned the fact that a variety to choose from, and this is exactly where I want to pick your brain when it comes to the content of these games. You as a person who knows very well the types of games that exist and you're well versed in the type of content, what do you think really appeals to the consumers? What type of content is considered by those who are producing these games?
So if we were to go by numbers, trying to be as unbiased as I possibly can, because obviously, like the doctor, I'm from a completely opposite spectrum. There are thousands of genres out there, that caters to every sort of market. There are games out there that really help kids, as well, learning, discerning between things. As opposed to there are games that honestly are mindless. But that, again, like you asked, it totally depends on what kind of content that you want and you want to start playing, So that depends on you, that depends on the individual, because there's all sorts of games out there.
Right. Would you say that violent content is dominates the type of gaming that's out there? Because that's what we hear a lot, the association of violence with the harmful effects of it. It's usually focuses on how most of these video games are aimed at killing and getting young kids desensitized to the act of killing.
Absolutely not. If you look at the numbers, for instance, Candy Crush, it got released like a couple of years ago. It's still one of the most highest grossing games out there with a large audience ranging from, kids to underage, like kids who from the age of, let's say, 7 to 12. And then you've got your target market from the age of 24 to 32. And that bracket includes male and female. So, and it has like about, I think, more than 5 to 10 million monthly active users. That's a big number.
Right.
So it's pretty, I feel that it's very dispersed if you start looking at genre-specific games. Yes, for example, GTA or Call of Duty or PUBG is mentioned quite a bit. Yes, because every time there's a new game and there's a fad going on, that tends to dominate the media and everyone seems to talk about it. And I think it's easy to talk about, violent things because, that's what makes news.
Right.
Candy Crush wouldn't make news.
Right, of course, Candy Crush wouldn't make. Ms. Ekman, when we're talking about these games and how Shayan mentioned that there's always a positive and negative to it, what positives do you see associated with gaming when it comes to a psychological perspective?
So if they use it in a healthy way, it's really good for us because we want to, show our aggressive. Maybe we can use it over the games, and we can get rid of this aggressiveness over the games. But the thing is not every time is like this. Because the thing is, we don't put a limitation on the kids. And children can watch everything, whatever they want, without limitation. They can download too many games on their parents' phones without asking their ages or such a things. And the thing is, it's related with the families, because family, first of all, put the limits. Of course, there's a positive effects because it makes us happy. But the thing is, if we cannot control this limit, it's gonna get worse. This is what I wanted to say. I wanna tell you one more thing. There is a game. It's called Momo Challenge. Maybe you heard about it. In my country, in Turkey, there's a couple of committing a suicide happen in Turkey among the children, and some research shows that there's some connection between those games and this committing a suicide. So we cannot get rid of this. Of course, there is a good and healthy games, especially for ADHD. There's a couple of games to increase your attention, but we cannot generalize that every games are good. We cannot say it, but we can of course say if you play the game with your family, let's say, if you have a limited time, it's good. But if you pass 4 hours a day or 4 or 5 hours, it's getting worse.
Right, that gets excessive. Right, I take your point there, Ms. Shayan. Now, when we're talking about the regulations surrounding gaming, and especially when we talk about the age recommendations for each and every game, do you see that there is a certain kind of trend, certain type of material is restricted from younger children, or do you feel like there is need for greater regulation?
I feel, to begin with the regulation as of now, there's a lot of regulation out there. There's an entire rating system, entire rating guide that you have to follow very strictly in terms of, when you're making games and when you're publishing games. Apple has their own guidelines. Google has their own guidelines. If we're talking about PC console games, they have their own guidelines, and they're very, very strict about it. It's the same as the programs you watch on TV. So yes, the user does have an option, and I do feel that yes, regulation. You should always revisit regulation often, just to see where you are at that very moment. So in terms of the studies that have been done, I've read a couple of them. Like you mentioned earlier, WHO, along with APA, the American Psychiatric Association, I think they're the ones who said that gaming is a form of addiction. Based on their research as well, the research is very, very new.
Right.
They're still researching on. I do agree, gaming could be an addiction, but in terms of monitoring and content administration, it's being done thoroughly.
Right.
I don't think there's anything that.
Right. Shayan, I just ask you one last question. Now, Ms. Ekman, of course, talked about how important it is to monitor young children. I want to put that same question to you. How much of a role do you think parents play in monitoring their children and preventing them from developing a gaming addiction?
So personally, especially the young parents that I know with younger kids, from let's say age 1 to 6 or 7, they closely monitor their kids quite a bit, because it's become cell phones or iPads are in every household now. It's very hard to keep it away from children. But this is from my personal experience. So this is from questions that I've asked parents. I don't have kids on my own, but just to be curious, that I've always asked this question from young parents. What do you do? Do you monitor your kids? And I would say 99%, actually 100% that I've spoken to, everyone monitors their kids.
Right.
And there's different, yeah. So in games, if you take China as an example, they recently changed their laws. So I don't remember the exact age from the top of my head, but I feel like under the age of maybe 10, kids' devices are registered and they cannot access games for more than, let's say, 3 to 4 hours a day. I think that's a good step,
Right.
And I think other governments can follow suit.
Right, that is in fact good to start limiting screen time for young children and of course limit the repercussions of them. Thank you so much, Shayan Zaim Khan, for joining us from Lahore, Ms. Sehadat, Ekman for joining us from Istanbul. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again next week with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.